Welcome to Outsmarting Antisemitism. This will be a 4-week course, and we will be going through 4 lessons. Lesson 1 is today, and that lesson is titled The Eternal People, in which one of the primary topics that we're going to be talking about is our emotional reaction to antisemitism. Next week, which is lesson 2, is going to be No Apologies, and it's where we talk a little bit about Jewish pride as opposed to trying to figure out what's wrong with us that people might hate us, learning to stand tall for who we are. Lesson 3, which will be on November, so that was November 8th, November 15th, will be lesson 3, which is the Promised Land, which we'll talk a little bit about anti-Semitism and anti-Israel bias, or anti-Zionism, whichever you prefer. And lesson 4 is titled Change of Heart, in which we will talk about whether it's possible to change the heart of an anti-Semite, and then what about those that are not anti-Semites? What about just people that maybe have misconceptions about Judaism and, much tamer anti-Semitism, not someone who has hatred in his heart and wants to blow up a shul, heaven forbid, right? So we're going to talk about that in lesson 4. So the reason I give this overview is because sometimes people have questions about all those topics, and sometimes I do have to say we're going to talk about that in lesson 2 or lesson 3. So I hope you'll pardon me if I do that. So lesson 1, The Eternal People, starts on page 5. On page. I'm giving you the teacher's manual page number. It starts on page 1 of your book. And we're going to get started by giving you a little bit of an idea for what exactly we're going to be talking about anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism has been around for a very, very long time. As long as there have been Jews, there have been 2 unwavering constants. There has been anti-Semitism, and there have been jokes about anti-Semitism. Right? Because that's how Jews cope with a lot of things. Humor. So for instance, the old one that they say about Tsar Alexander of Russia in 1881, when a government official approached a rabbi and said, "I assume you know who was behind it." And so the rabbi looks at him and says, "I have no idea, but I assume that sooner or later the government will get around to blaming the Jews and the milkman." So the government official looks at him and says, "What? Why the milkman?" And he looks at him and says, "Well, why the Jews?" So as long as Jews have been around, anti-Semitism has been around, and methods of coping with anti-Semitism have been around. Looking back, the second half of the 20th century seemed to be like a safe time for Jews living in the diaspora. Sure, there was Israel, and we were worried about the concern for Jews living in Israel, but as so far as the US, Canada, even Europe was concerned, anti-Semitism seemed to be on the decline. Unfortunately, recently, that has not been the case, and that's kind of the inspiration for this course. I'm not here to really prove to you that anti-Semitism is on the rise, so we'll just take about 60 seconds to talk about it. If you take a look in your textbook at on page 3, at figure 1.1, you see research done by a group called Campaign Against Anti-Semitism. This report is from 2019. We try to be as recent as possible in the reports that we're giving here, and it definitely indicates that a lot of British Jews have a lot of concern for what's going on in the country, and those Jews are leaving the country. Right, so they were asked to say whether they strongly agree or strongly disagree, or anywhere along that spectrum. In the past 2 years, I have considered leaving Britain due to anti-Semitism. And you have here 2018, 2017, and 2016's results as well. But just looking at 2019, and you see how it's grown, you see that many people, many Jews, strongly agree, or neither agree or disagree, and then there's only a smaller percentage that disagree or strongly disagree. Similarly, with regards to public displays of Judaism, which is kind of a more subtle way of measuring it, are you comfortable walking in the street with something that shows visibly that you're Jewish? We've all had that kind of conversation with someone, whether it's with our parents or whether it's with our children or our grandchildren, right? Oh, you don't have to walk around with a kippah. You don't have to walk around with a Star of David necklace. Why does everybody need to know you're Jewish? That kind of idea. So here they asked people directly, are you comfortable showing these sort of signs in public? And again, we see the troubling rise from 2016, 2017, 2018, from this same organization, the trouble that there is. If we turn to the United States, of course, we all know that there are 2 highlight events which kind of stick out in everyone's mind. On Shabbos, October 17th, 2018, an assailant indoctrinated with white supremacy ideology, stormed the Tree of Life synagogue in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and ultimately killed 11 Jews and wounding 6 others. At the time, that was described as, I think till today, it's described as the deadliest anti-Semitic attack in Jewish history in America. And then, of course, a year later, in April of 2019, on Pesach, I think it was the last day of Pesach morning, Jews were praying in synagogue at Chabad of Poway, and again, a man filled with anti-Semitic views stormed the shul, ultimately killing 1 person, famously wounding the rabbi and some others more slightly, and those kind of stick out in our head. But even if you look at the data, you kind of see a similar trend in the United States. In 2019, the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, tabulated 2,107 anti-Semitic incidents. So that can include anything from assault to vandalism to harassment throughout the United States. Anything like that was counted as an incident of anti-Semitism, and they calculated 2,107, which has been a steady increase since they began tracking these sort of incidents in 1979, and it was a 12% increase as compared to the year before in 2018. You can see that here on the screen, how that's gone up and down, etc. Thank God here in Pasadena, I would say that we haven't really experienced any outright anti-Semitic, incidents against the synagogue. Nothing even as much as spray painting a swastika. But it's important for us to remember that just because a particular city doesn't experience that, of course, it affects everyone, right? We can skip over on page 6, figure 1.4, 1.1.5. I guess they're just trying to be more thorough in their research. So you see Australia, you see Canada, etc. That's kind of what leads us to having a course today. But I want to take 60 seconds to just clarify what the goals of the course today are, because when it comes to anti-Semitism, you can really take it from lots of different perspectives. So what is this course, and what is this course not? Welcome, Lisa, by the way. I'm glad to see you made it on.
Oh, thank you.
You got it.
I'm glad to be here.
You got it. And somebody else is coming in right now. Hold on. Just as Galaxy S7 Edge. So I'm going to assume that's one of us, but we'll see as they arrive. So for many Jews, starting in the 20th century, responding or reacting to anti-Semitism has been kind of part and parcel of being Jewish. We all grew up telling ourselves, telling our children, never again, right? The Holocaust is a recent memory, and that's a very big deal and a very big component of our Judaism. In fact, in 2013, there was a study of American Jews done by the Pew Research Center, and you can see this in figure 1.6. They asked Jews, what is important to you? What is essential to being a Jew in the 21st century in the United States? And they give a whole list here, right? Including eating traditional Jewish foods, so challah, chicken soup, I don't know, Mendy's Deli in Manhattan, this kind of thing. And leading an ethical and moral life, religious, right? So religious life, observing Jewish law, this kind of thing. And then, of course, remembering the Holocaust. And remembering the Holocaust scored #1 consistently among Jews. As you can see, 76%, that's way ahead of anything else among Jews in what their identity of Judaism is. And that's not to say that shouldn't be the case. However, what I would like to point out is that in this course, one of the things we're going to be very careful not to do is to make fighting anti-Semitism, is to not make fighting anti-Semitism the sum total of our Judaism. And this leads us to text 1a. So why don't we start off by reading it? Lon, can you get us started? Text 1a. We're on page 9.
Page 9, okay. Okay, hi everybody. All right. Most Jews will immediately step forward when Jews anywhere are being attacked by anti-Semites. This, of course, is as it should be. What is regrettable, however, is that for some Jews, the fight against anti-Semitism becomes the sum total of their Jewish identity. Recently, a much respected Jewish communal leader lamented to me that he regretted not having educated his children about Jewish traditions and culture. He was, however, very proud of the fact that he had embedded within them a total intolerance for anti-Semitism. His kids were prepared to be at the barricades to do battle against this hatred and many others as well. His comments made me sad. Anti-Semitism has become the drummer to which his family's Jewish identity marches. They know of Jew as object, not subject. In other words, what is done to Jews becomes far more significant than what Jews do. This well-intentioned Jewish father has deprived his children of a rich and multifaceted legacy. They've been taught to see themselves mainly as perennial victims. This cedes to the oppressor control over one's destiny. It leaves many Jews, including this man's children, aware of what to be against, but not what to be for.
This, as you can imagine, is not a healthy way for anyone to live. Never mind for a Jew who has such a rich history, right? In other words, we have to be careful whenever we talk about rises in anti-Semitism and the concern that there is about that. And we're going to talk about that and how we should deal with it. We have to be careful not to make that the sum total of Judaism. Why? Because anti-Semitism is only about what is done to Jews, right? What is done to Jews. And it becomes far more significant, unfortunately, than what Jews do. And that's a problem. As Barry Weiss, by the way, these are the people we're quoting now are very, very contemporary scholars. So Deborah Lipstadt, who we just quoted, is the author of Antisemitism Here and Now. She's alive today, born in 1947. She served as the director of the Holocaust Memorial, the Holocaust Memorial Museum, and taught Jewish studies at Emory University. You know, someone who's really involved in this field. Similarly, Barry Weiss, who made it very famous. Many of you may have seen this speech, which they're quoting right here, at the No Hate, No Fear Solidarity March in New York City, very widely documented just now, January 2020. She shared a very similar sentiment. Joanne, can I ask you to read, please?
On earth 4, right? 1B?
Yeah.
The Jewish people were not put on earth to be anti-Semites. We were put on earth to be Jews.
So this is a very common issue. And the reason it's such a common issue is because of what we mentioned, that anti-Semitism is such an old pandemic. So therefore, Jews have always been reacting to it, and it's become such a big part of Judaism that some people forget that if all of what you're doing is fighting against others, then what are you fighting for, right? You may as well give up the whole game. Stop fighting against this. Stop identifying as a Jew. Heaven forbid. I'm not saying you should take that path, but we have to remember that we have an identity and that there's an identity to protect, and we have to make sure to protect that identity. So as a result, in this course, we are going to make sure that we will talk about anti-Semitism. We'll make sure to point out how problematic it is, but we will recognize that it's also problematic to overemphasize it. We all remember Tevye, right, from Fiddler on the Roof, saying, I know, we are your chosen people, but couldn't you choose somebody else every once in a while, right? So we got to make sure that that's not our attitude, and that we recognize that we know what we're here for. So that's kind of one thing. So therefore, the course is not going to be a rallying call to direct our entire Jewishness towards fighting anti-Semitism. Its goal is not to get us bogged down in negativity, to make sure we're following every single anti-Semitic incident that occurs. It's not to try to figure out what makes an anti-Semite tick. And it's also not to try to figure out what sort of governmental policies we can put in place in order to fight anti-Semitism. So the big question is, what is this course about? So if you take a look at page 11, I think this will be very useful for many of you. I think this very, very beautifully summarizes what we're trying to answer with this course. Number one, what are some tools for coping with fears triggered by anti-Semitism? And number two, what role does faith play in addressing anti-Semitism? Those two questions we're going to answer today in lesson one. The next two questions, what are the best strategies to reduce anti-Semitism? And what are the root causes of anti-Semitism? How does identifying those factors impact our efforts to prevent the hatred? Right? In other words, not just for no reason identifying what makes an anti-Semite tick, but trying to figure out how that has relevance to how we react to it. Those will be answered in lesson two. As I mentioned, we're going to talk about Israel-focused anti-Semitism and how we can determine what is proper, because we're allowed to criticize Israel. In fact, many Jews are at the forefront of that criticism. So we'll talk about how we identify what's anti-Semitic and what's just anti-Israel rhetoric, and how can we forestall well-meaning Jewish youth from unwittingly lending their voices to anti-Semitic agendas. That we'll talk about in lesson 3. Those two answers. That's a very important one. By the way, lesson 6. It ties into anti-Israel and it ties into what's going on campus in today's day and age, and we'll talk about that. And then finally, lesson 7, we'll talk about what's the best strategy for dealing with a public figure who takes an unfavorable position towards us. And actually, we'll also talk about not a public figure, just you have a coworker who maybe has anti-Semitic tendencies and doesn't even realize it, and you that comes up. That makes all of us feel uncomfortable, right? Because it's so close to home. A coworker, somebody that we're close to, a non-Jewish friend, not even a coworker, right? Somebody that we're actually close to, and we want to be able to have that conversation. How can we do that in a gentle way without accusing? Right? We all have one uncle who accuses everyone who should, heaven forbid, skip you in line at the grocery. He's an anti-Semite, right? Without coming across as that uncle. Without coming across as someone who just calls anti-Semitism whenever whenever they feel like they're being wronged. Okay, so that is the goal. And as we do that, we're not going to lose sight of the fact that this is just one topic of contemporary relevance to Jews. You ready to dive into it? So today, the main focus is going to be the first 2 questions. What are tools for coping with fear, anxiety, outrage, those kind of feelings that we feel when we hear about an anti-Semitic, whatever, when we encounter anti-Semitism, wherever it is, whether it's in the news, hearing about it from someone, an actual encounter with someone that has those kind of views, etc. And we're going to talk about what role faith plays in that conversation. The common denominator, by the way, between all of these points that we're trying to talk about in this course is that we're trying to take an agenda-driven approach. We're trying to service the people on this Zoom, and the people watching this recording, and the people that are going to be in person tonight at 7:30, which means not government officials, not leaders of the Jewish people that are going to, me, in my little life, how can I make sure I know how to deal with anti-Semitism in that instance? Okay. So on page 12, we're going to start off with an exercise. I encourage you all to fill this out for yourself. If you're using a PDF, write it down on a piece of paper and you'll copy it over to your textbook later. This will prove very, very useful for you later on in the course to come and revisit this and see how much you've grown or you've learned or you've changed, etc. So exercise 1.1 asks the following question. Have you ever had any sort of anti-Semitic encounter? That can be verbal, physical, emotional, where someone directly made you the victim of their anti-Semitic situation. If not, so if yes, that's great. Keep that. That's not great, but that's a good one to keep in mind. And keep that on. If not, consider any sort of recent anti-Semitic incident that you heard about. Write down the incident for yourself, and much more importantly, what were your immediate feelings after the incident? We're looking for one-word answers. Fear, anxiety, rage, I don't know, happiness, right? Whatever. Those are one-word answers for an emotion. So put down the 3 immediate feelings you can think of. If you only think of 2, that's also fine. And then what were some actions that you took as a result? Whether they were protective actions, whether they were emotional actions, you spoke to someone about it, whatever it is. If you can write that down, I think that would be great. If someone is willing to share, I think that would be very, very nice. But I don't expect that. It's very private. It might be your call. Anybody want to share with us something? Go ahead. So let's start off. Share with us the incident, obviously briefly.
Well, there's actually 2 things. I've never really been the victim of any kind of anti-Semitic anything. However, I have very strong memory of being in elementary school, and a girl there dropped some change. Maybe it was a dime. This is in the 50s. And she said to the group of people standing around, "Nobody touch that or you're a Jew." And then she turned to me and said something like, "I don't mean it about you, Joanne," which was, this is like when I was 10 years old or something. But another thing was when I was in med school, and we went to some, a group of us went to some, I don't remember exactly what it was, some clinic, and the administrator there was talking about the difficulties dealing with this population, and he talked about the financial problems, and he talked about Jewing down somebody in terms of the money. I didn't say anything at the time, but when I got back to campus, I did comment to whoever our preceptor was, and it got back to that person. And at the next meeting, he apologized to me. You know, because people don't realize, they use these slang words and don't realize, you know, that's offensive. But I want to mention something else, and I didn't know what to say. I have a niece who lives in Olympia, Washington, and she is married to a non-Jew. And one day he heard a neighbor, and he wasn't sure exactly which house it was somewhere behind there, you know, like in the backyard of another yard, two men talking, and this is Olympia, Washington, and they were spouting all this anti-Semitic stuff and talking about wanting to kill Jews or this, that, or the other. And he was very frightened because his wife and his daughters are Jewish, and he didn't do anything. My niece told me about it. They were very scared, but they didn't do anything. They didn't talk to the police or anything. And, you know, I thought that was kind of sad that they were too afraid to actually do anything, although they didn't really know who these people were. You know, they said they didn't seem to be people who lived there. Maybe it was a family member of someone who lived behind them.
Okay.
But yeah.
Thank you for sharing, Joanne. Let's use one of your incidents as one of the ones we'll use for the purpose of our conversation, okay? Let's go with the med school incident, because first of all, it's more personal to you. It happened to you. It's not just to a niece. And at the same time, it's something that you actually wrestle with, obviously, right? It obviously affected you. So let's start off with, do you remember the feelings, the immediate feelings that you had after the incident?
Yes, I was indignant.
Okay, indignant. Any other feelings, or that's the main one?
You know, a little angry that he used that slur.
Yeah. Indignant goes together with angry, right? And that's it.
Yeah, and I remember wondering if I should say something at the time. I don't believe I did. I mean, this is 40 years ago.
Right. And then the action that you took was that you went to whoever it was, the dean or whoever.
Well, it was some preceptor, and yeah.
Right. So I think we can all agree, and Joanne, I hope you're not going to contradict me on this, that probably anger, even though it's natural, right, or fear, if it's more of a you know, direct threat or something like that, right? Like, which is probably what your niece felt, right? Or what your nephew in this case felt. Those are not positive feelings to feel. And then when we talk about what the immediate actions are in the aftermath, let's go with that story that from Olympia, Washington. Probably not doing anything is probably not the right idea, right? Now, let's like translate this to other stories, famous stories of antisemitism, right? Probably going over to their home with a bat and beating the living daylights out of them is probably also not the right reaction, right? And I think it's worth noting in your niece's situation particularly that they made a decision, clearly an active decision, not to go to the police. Right. So that might not always be the right decision either, right? In other words, showing like a public, I don't know, you know, like, let's be honest, if they were making threatening comments, going to the police kind of calls attention to it and makes a whole big deal out of it. And that might not be the right reaction. So that's kind of what we want to talk about today. So, and you'll note that we divided this clearly in half: feelings and actions, right? So you have unconstructive worry, and what that does to us, by the way, which we'll talk about in just a moment, how it makes us incapable of response sometimes, right? If we're just worried, which I would imagine is what your niece and nephew maybe still feel till today, just worry, anxiety, and it paralyzes us, makes us incapable of a response, right? Or to some people, it goes the opposite way, right? It doesn't seem that this was the case when you were in med school, but to many people, if they get an anti-Semitic comment like that, and I know this has happened to me, by the way, you hear an anti-Semitic a comment like that from someone, not that you know, but someone who's in your circle, And you're like, oh my gosh, I've known this person for whatever it was, so many years, so long, whatever it is, or I've been in this person's class for X amount of months, and this never came up. I never would have thought that this person is an anti-Semite. And what happens then is it leads to, if it starts with anger, it can lead to everybody's anti-Semitic, just they don't all show it. I think we can all agree that these are unhealthy attitudes. But I do want to take a moment to talk about why. Even though it's obvious, text 2 is a very powerful statement from the Talmud. We grew up in the United States in 2021, and we're living our lives, and everybody knows anxiety is a bad word, right? Anxiety is a terrible emotion, but I don't know how often we take the time to identify to ourselves why. Probably you, yes, Joanne, and your husband, and other psychologists and therapists and people in that field. But I don't know how long we take the time to identify to ourselves why anxiety is a bad feeling. Heidi, text 2, please. Heidi, you're muted. I'm sorry.
Sorry, I was looking at the Hebrew and sounding it out.
Oh, okay. Text 2.
So I'm anxiety drawbacks. Is that where we are? It is stated in the book of Ben Sirah, do not allow anxiety into your heart, for anxiety has killed the mighty. King Solomon said the same. If there is anxiety in your heart, quash it.
So we're going to talk about what King Solomon means by quash it momentarily, but that's already getting to what you do about anxiety. But let's start with just what's wrong with having anxiety. And one of the biggest issues with anxiety, in fact, Kabbalistically, we're told that those kind of negative emotions, anxiety, depression, sadness, they come from the root of the cosmic earth. In other words, from earth, water, fire, wind. Without getting too much into it, it comes from earth. And the reason it's connected to earth is because it makes us heavy, or at least one of the symptoms where we see that it comes from earth is because it makes us heavy. And what I mean by heavy is, it's like similar to laziness almost. You know how laziness, but somebody's lazy, just can't get anything done? Anxiety has a similar effect in a much more negative way. Anxiety, depression, sadness, these kind of things, they draw us down, they weigh us down, and then we can't do anything. Never mind react to whatever it is that's making us anxious. So we have to learn to deal with the anxiety, but anxiety is always caused by something. So you have to learn with how to deal with the cause of the anxiety, the root of the anxiety, in order to recognize how we can actually lead productive lives, and then eventually do something about whatever it is that's actually causing us that anxiety. So why don't I ask this question to one person instead of having everybody answer it? Ron, can I pick on you? On page 13, there's a question here. All right, everybody can think of it from their perspective here. In the context of anti-Semitism, what do you think are some means of avoiding unhealthy panic? And let me just clarify this question for a second. Because we want to be concerned about anti-Semitism, right? There's something positive about the fact that a rabbi in Boston gets stabbed, or a synagogue in Germany gets a swastika painted on it, and we are concerned about that. There's something positive about that, right? We're Jewish, we feel Jewish, we identify with it, etc. The anxiety is unhealthy. So, Ron, in your opinion, what do you think are some means of avoiding unhealthy panic? In other words, still being concerned, but not letting that lead into unhealthy panic.
I guess just realizing at the time that you're not experiencing that type of incident yourself, and moving forward with a positive attitude.
And if you are experiencing it, the anxiety is still not a healthy emotion.
No, but I've definitely experienced a lot of adverse situations, both as being a Jew and a non-Jew. And in each one, I've just handled the situation as it came along.
Right, but I guess we're looking for tips, practical tips. How do we avoid the unhealthy panic? You have anything specific to share? So you mentioned there's a value. I just pressed you for more. In other words, let me just clarify. Ron mentioned there's a lot of value for when something is happening somewhere else. We can recognize that it's not happening to us, which is important. Now there's a lot to discuss there, because if it's happening somewhere else, it can happen by us, and how that affects us, etc. but keeping a sane mind helps, not letting the unhealthy panic set in. But do you have any specific tips for this, Ron? What do you think?
I've always approached my daily living with the idea that work with the hand that you're dealt with and move forward. So when I encounter a situation, I'm able to handle it.
Right. Okay. We are going to take some time now to talk specifically about dealing with feelings, emotions. Then, towards the end of our lesson, we're going to talk about how to deal with actions. In other words, what should we do as a result? So we're going to split those two things: the emotional reaction to some sort of negative or adverse feeling, and then the practical reaction. Okay, so we're going to start with the emotional, and we're going to take a three-pronged approach, and we're hopefully you'll walk out with some very powerful tips. We're going to split it into three things: the miraculous people, consider the full picture, and I fear not because you are with me. So on page 14, we start with the miraculous people. Okay. Before we do so, by the way, let me make a disclaimer, because we're going to talk a lot about staying positive in the face of anti-Semitism. This can easily, right? We're going to talk about optimism. We're going to talk about faith. We're going to talk about positivity. But this can easily be misconstrued as I'm ignoring the reality. I'm shoving it under the rug. And I want to make a big disclaimer that we're not talking about that. We're just trying to give tips while at the same time acknowledging that it's there, doing whatever we can do, also making sure that we're not letting it lead to unhealthy panic and the sky is falling down on my head and that kind of feeling. Paralysis. So let's begin. We'll start with a very, very powerful text from Deborah Lipstadt, right? The author of Antisemitism Here and Now, etc. She was interviewed at the National Jewish Retreat in 2019, and I think suffice it to say that she's pretty steep in the world of antisemitism. She's aware, probably more than us, of how much it's rising, and yet she offers some very powerful insight here. Shana, can you read for us, please? Sorry, you're muted. I can't hear you. I apologize. I see you have the book, but you're muted. Shana, just unmute. Okay, we can't hear you. All right, but I see you have the book by Deborah Lipstadt. Okay.
You push the
All right.
space bar. That should unmute her.
What? Yeah, Shana, can you hit this space bar? Maybe that will work. Sometimes it does. Oh, there you go. Now we should be able to hear you. Go ahead. You were saying something.
I don't have the page number in the book for that particular quote.
Oh, that's okay though. Do you have the text that I sent out, the PDF that I sent out?
I read it earlier, but I didn't have time to copy it.
That's okay. No worries. Soon you'll have a physical textbook in your hands. It's already on the way to Canada. Okay. So Ron, if we can ask you please to read for us text 3. Don't forget to unmute.
Okay. The fact that we're here is such a historical anomaly, it makes no sense. So sometimes when I'm asked about anti-Semitism, people will say, well, how can you be optimistic in all this? How can you see the positive? It's such a dreary situation.
I think we all relate to that, right? And I think she had that on steroids because she researches anti-Semitism all the time, right? What was her response? Go ahead.
And I say, because we shouldn't be here. And the fact that we are here shouldn't be taken for granted.
As a researcher of anti-Semitism, Deborah is sharing with us, thank you, Ron, that in addition to all of this and all of the anti-Semitism and how long it's been around and how terrible some of the results of anti-Semitism have been, together with that comes the same research showing you, and yet the Jews have survived. Now, we'll get to why that is, right? We could talk whether it's a miracle, we could talk about whether Jews are resilient, we could talk about whether it's just our sense of humor that gets us through anything, right? But the very fact that there is an end in sight is actually very empowering. And the Rambam, Maimonides, shared something very, very similar, okay? So in the year 1168, So the Rambam has many works. Maimonides has many works. One of them is the Mishnah Torah. He has a Guide for the Perplexed. These are some very popular ones. One of the lesser known ones is something called Igeret Teman, or the Epistle to Yemen. And that was basically a very long letter that the Rambam wrote to the Jews of Yemen when they were faced with a three-pronged assault. Okay. On the one hand, there was a fanatical Muslim cleric that rose to power, and he was leading Yemen and forcing, as happened very often in Jewish history, Jews to convert to Islam. I don't think it was death. I don't think the threat was death. I think it was just harsh punishment and suffering and segregation and that kind of thing, if you didn't. So that was one thing going on. Now, at the same time, from a much less threatening perspective, there was one particular well-known Jewish figure at the time who converted to Islam and made it his personal duty to go around and try to missionize the Jewish people. So he was kind of going around in the Jewish circles and trying to get them to convert to Islam. And as if that wasn't enough, there was a false Messiah who was also walking around saying, I'm the Mashiach, and Mashiach is here, and it's time to go to Israel, and all that sort of stuff. And there were many signs that he wasn't actually Mashiach, but there were Jews that were following him, and this was causing a lot of discord among the Jewish community. So one of the rabbis and leaders of the Jewish community in Yemen turned to Maimonides, who had already, this was already later in Maimonides' lifetime, and he says, we need help. And he says, primarily, we need philosophical fortitude in our Judaism, right? In our Jewish thought, and to stay strong with our Jewish beliefs. So the Rambam writes what's called an epistle to Yemen, which is very long. And one of his thoughts are very similar to what the Bar Lipstadt just shared. Who can read for us? Lisa, can you read for us, please? Do you have the text open in front of you?
I don't.
You don't. Okay. Joanne, can you read for us text 4, please?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Hashem assured our father Jacob early on that although the nations would enslave his descendants, treat them cruelly, and subjugate them, his children would survive and endure, whereas those who enslaved them would eventually disappear. God told him, your descendants will be like the dust of the earth. Although they are destined to be trampled and downtrodden, as everyone tramples the dust of the earth, they will overcome and triumph in the end, just as, to continue the analogy, the dust eventually rises over those who trampled upon them when their corpses are buried. So Israel will remain in existence, whereas those who have trodden upon her will not. The Creator similarly assured us through his prophets that we will never be destroyed, that he will never permit our annihilation, and that we will never stray from being a nation devoted to its purpose. Just as it is impossible for God's own existence to be nullified, so it is impossible that we should be destroyed and eliminated from the world. So spoke Malachi, I am God and I have not changed, and you, the children of Jacob, have not been destroyed.
So what Maimonides is telling the Jewish people is he says, look, the very fact of Jewish survival, and this is in 1168, we have so many more, unfortunately, things that we can point to throughout the ages, and yet we've come out of them alive. I mean, the Holocaust in recent memory is a tremendous proof of that. What he's encouraging them to do is he says, look, I'm not saying anti-Semitism is easy. Certainly anti-Semitism should not exist. What he's saying is that when we have suffering, one of the things that we can point to is to the fact that the Jewish people always seem to survive. And that, coupled with the fact that we know that in our Torah, God promises us that the Jewish people will survive, is a very empowering statement. You know, there have been many attempts, and yet God has always made sure that the Jewish people haven't disappeared. Now, we're going to talk shortly about the distinction between me personally, right, or the Jewish people as a whole, because this promise is obviously the Jewish people as a whole, because we know that many Jews have perished from anti-Semitism. But we'll get to that in a moment. Now, why is this empowering? This is empowering because it's not just about a track record. So if God was able to do it despite all these other people, the Romans and the Germans and the whatever, and the Spanish and everybody in between, so then he can do it again. It's not just like a statement of how powerful God is or how miraculous he is, etc. It's also in a weird way a statement that we're saying we're not disappearing. So even though right now it's very tough, just hold on. Like it's like hold on just a little bit longer. It's gonna be okay. It's like a parent telling a child, it's gonna be okay when they know it's gonna be okay. Like you're at the dentist and it's very painful right now. They're taking the tooth out. You're gonna be okay. Fast forwarding has a weird effect on the human mind that it actually helps us to calm ourselves a little bit. I have a very personal analogy for this, or a very personal experience where I like to use this. I was once, I want to say in my early 20s, I was organizing, I want to say it was like a Shabbaton or something for kids, and I had staff to run it and everything. And then like the morning of, like the kids were going to be arriving at 7:00. And the morning of, I think 2 of the staff said they couldn't make it. I don't remember what happened, but they couldn't make it. And no matter how hard I tried, I found myself at like 4:30 p.m. still scrambling to find staff. And I remember my boss telling me this, and it was really weird why it calmed me down. He said, take a moment to he says, take 30 seconds, 60 seconds, while you're doing everything you need to do in order to make it happen, to fast forward to 9:00 p.m. tonight, or whatever, or to 9:00 a.m. the next morning. He says, everything is going to be okay. You're going to figure something out. Just right now, you're in the middle of all that stress and it's building up in your head. Recognizing that it's going to be okay can actually help you in the moment get through the stress of what's going on, despite the fact that you actually have to work on finding someone else. And I think similarly, this can help us very often, especially when we couple it together, we recognize that it has to do with a godly protection and miraculous. It's miraculous that the Jewish people have survived, right? I think that helps a lot. But that alone would not be enough. That's only one prong. The second prong we're going to talk about is considering the full picture. Okay? This is a very, very interesting fact. Whenever there is something negative going on, there is always something positive to think about. It doesn't make a difference how dire the situation is. There is something positive to think about. Before we get into one example, which I want to share, I'm actually curious. I'm sure we can all do this as an exercise. And I want to get you guys used to doing this exercise. That's why I'll call on somebody now. Lisa, maybe if you can share with us. So let's say you're in a situation where there's something strong about anti-Semitism that's really driving you to feel anxious, right? Always, if we zoom out and we look at the big picture, right? There's always something positive that we can look at to say, life ain't that bad. The sky is literally falling down on our heads. Now, our natural kickback emotions don't do that. We start off right away saying the anxiety kicks in and that builds on itself. Why am I so anxious, right? And we start to think about all sorts of terrible scenarios, etc. And it builds on itself until we're literally frantic. That leads to a panic attack, right? And that's because all we can think about, the only thing we can see, it's almost like a tunnel vision. The only thing we can see are the negative things. And those negative things are real, by the way. We're not taking away from that. But, and usually this is somebody, a third party can share this with us, there's always something we can do where we can zoom out and say, but this is actually positive news. So Lisa, maybe you can share with us, like for instance, right now, anti-Semitism is on the rise. There's all sorts of negative headlines. What do you think we can think about, all of us can think about right now that would help us keep sight of the bigger picture?
First, well, I do several things. First, I take a breath, I smile, and I think I'm just a little cog in this big creation. I am not the one who created the world. Hashem is the one who created the world.
Amazing. This deserves like a standing ovation, but it's the next tip to share. Here,
Right. But,
one second,
okay.
Lisa. Right now, I want to focus on one other thing. That was a very good point you mentioned. We're about to get there. Don't worry. I'm not a rabbi who's going to give a class about anxiety and say and not talk about believing in God. Of course, we're going to talk about that.
Well, right,
But before we do, one second. Before we do, I want to try to figure out. It's a much more practical. It's a much more simple, I should say. You don't have to be the biggest believer in God in order to say this. There's always something positive you can think about. What's something else from the picture that we can always remind ourselves?
right. And then I bring myself back down to, okay, now, because I didn't create the world and because I'm here right now, what can I do? I'm not alone. I can write. I can call if I need to talk to someone. I can call somebody. If I need to pray, I can pray. If I need to recognize that it's not just happening to me, it can be happening to more than one person. We're not alone. We're not alone in this. I'm not alone in this.
Okay.
I sing. I tend to either study Torah or I tend to sing when I get stressed.
Thank you, Lisa. These are all such amazing tips. I really thank you for sharing with us. I do want to try to keep the conversation focused though, because I think this is a very good tip and we shouldn't just pass it by. Those were all amazing tips. Singing, keeping our faith, praying, studying, writing is something you I know you like to write. But keeping track of the big picture should not be underestimated. What I mean by that is as follows. I'm going to share something now at the risk of maybe pretending like anti-Semitism doesn't exist, but it's not. That's not what's going on here. Recognizing that two truths can be true at the same time is extremely important when something is overwhelming us. We spoke about how there's a rise in anti-Semitic incidents. Looking at a chart like this, to me, naturally causes anxiety. And one simple thing you can do is try to find another truth at the same time that's also true at the same time, which is actually extremely positive. Let's take a look at figure 1.8. And the reason we're doing this is because we should take a moment to remember that in the United States, despite the fact that anti-Semitism is on the rise, this has not led to governmental policies against Jews. Now, I know that sounds like you literally chose the worst thing that could ever happen to Jews, that the government itself should be institutionalizing anti-Semitism, right? And you're saying, so as long as that's not going on, we're fine. No, nobody's saying we're fine. I'm just saying that looking at a larger picture often helps us. And there's always something to think about. Heaven forbid if it does spill over into governmental policies, right? There will be something else we can think about. It's not so terrible. There's something else to think about that's positive, that's going on at the same time while there's something negative going on. And the effect that that has on us is that it reminds us that this particular incident, this negativity that we're going through right now is not everything. It's not the full picture. It's just a good tip. It's just like, by the way, this tip can be applied to any part of life. If you're extremely stressed out because you just lost your job and you have no idea how you're going to pay rent this month, there's always something in your life that you can point to that is positive, that is going well. Everybody has something. Why? Because if you're alive, if you're healthy, if you have a good family, everybody has something that they can point to say, yes, this part of my life is very stressful and going terrible, but at least something else is going well. Remembering those two truths often has a way of grounding us and not allowing that anxiety to overwhelm us. So that's number one. It hasn't spilled over to governmental policies. So that can be another truth, which is true at the same time. Now, even in individual attitudes, and again, not to say that this makes things perfect, not to say this even make things good. And I'm sure we can bring data about other things that are negative. But this is one piece of data we can look at, which is good. Figure 1.8 on page 18 in your books, which then continues into figure 1.9, is, again, by the ADL in 2019, they put out a survey, an index of questions, and they asked individuals, they're trying to measure individual anti-Semitic sentiment. How much do you agree with the following anti-Semitic trope? And they range, from lesser ones to more aggressive ones and more violent ones, right? And you see the list here. Many of us recognize these things as the typical, stereotypical anti-Semitic tropes. And as it turns out, that even while Pittsburgh is happening and Poway is happening in 2018 and 2019, since 1964, there's been a tremendous drop in anti-Semitic attitudes among individual people. Now, so why is that not leading to less anti-Semitic incidents? And there's more anti-Semitic incidents, whatever. I'll leave that to the ADL to figure out. Probably this has a little bit to do with the internet and social media, and maybe, tying into how much access people have to other anti-Semitic, once they start going down a path of anti-Semitism, how much they have path to other people's anti-Semitism, etc. So maybe the individual people, even though they're becoming less, are having more of an effect, whatever. That's all, and that's not the purpose of this course. But just looking at this graph at the same time as looking at the other graphs, right? So remember, so you have, sorry, hold on, I went back too much, my mistake. So you have one truth going on, which is that anti-Semitic incidents in the United States are on the rise. And at the same time, it's comforting to see, again, even though this doesn't help the other one, it's comforting to see that anti-Semitic attitudes are going down. And realizing those two helps to ground us, to not allow one of them to overwhelm us and cause us too much anxiety or panic or what have you. And that's precisely what the ADL came to the conclusion in text 5, that there is heartening news as well. Leah, can you read for us, please? Text 5, we're on page 20. Leah? I'm not sure if she's with us. So Lana, it's back to you.
All right, can I make a comment before we
Sure, yes, please.
So getting back to this idea of looking at other things that are going on, you're talking about this chart that shows the rise in anti-Semitism to be offset, to feel better, by a chart that shows a decrease in attitudes. Let me move on, because that's a minor point.
Okay.
What I would make about that is looking at other things that are going on in Judaism in the world at that moment, on that day. For instance, Israel is helping people, and we were in a conversation yesterday, and Jews helping people in Miami, Florida, get out from these buildings that fell down because they have expertise in that. Jews are helping people in Haiti. Jews are doing things that are very positive. And to me, that would be part of the zeitgeist that one has to consider. What else is happening, like you say, as a thesis, that makes one feel not so bad about the anti-Semitism part? It doesn't just have to do with charts over time combating, if it's that way, this is this
Absolutely.
way.
So
look at the moment and what else is happening that we're doing that is good for the world. Thank you.
Right. That's a great point. And I want to clarify that what we're doing right now, I don't even know if it holds water. Like, could be somebody who's more of an expert in anti-Semitism would look at this and say, oh yeah, but you're only looking at this, you're not looking at that, etc. That's not the purpose of this conversation. What Lon just did is another version of exactly the same exercise of what we're doing now. And I think we should all try and do this more often, particularly when anti-Semitism starts to build up in our minds and starts to overwhelm us. Why? Because grounding ourselves with other positive news, and like Lon says, it can be general positive news, it can be Jewish positive news, it can be directly related to anti-Semitism positive news. At the same time that you're hearing about a negative anti-Semitic something that happened somewhere else, you can choose to think, oh, just last week somebody told me that actually they have a very good relationship with these nudges. Balance it out in your mind to remind yourself that it's grounded. Lon, now text 5 when you're ready.
Yes, and I would say also Jewish positive news is the key.
Oh, for sure.
Positive.
Yeah.
So, okay, here we go. Text 5. It is heartening that attitudes toward Jews have improved over the last 5 years and historically have declined significantly in America, said Abraham H. Foxman, ADL National Director. On the occasion of our centennial, it causes us to take a broader perspective to appreciate how far we have come in 100 years. In 1913, there were no surveys like this, but anti-Semitism was rife in public and private expressions in universities, jobs, and neighborhoods. In 1964, when we did our first survey, we found that 29% of Americans held anti-Semitic views. So we and America have made real progress.
And again, whether that does that fix other stats that are going on that are troubling? No, it doesn't fix it. But what it does is for us, it helps us to ground ourselves. Yes, Shayna.
One thing that I think helps personally to overcome this very negative and shocking reality of anti-Semitism is to think, what can I do? What can I do to make a difference about that? Very recently I moved to Montreal, and there have been, over the years, but even more recently, a number of anti-Semitic incidents here.
Mhm.
And friends of mine were saying, we just have to stay, kind of out of sight and lay low and not be too visible. But since I just moved here, I had to put up a mezuzah on my door, and I live in an apartment building, even more so. So
Mhm.
I have a lot of neighbors right around me. So I just felt very comfortable. Comfortable is not the word. I felt I was always going to put up my mezuzah anyway, but I also felt this is a time to really be out there.
Right. So you're starting a whole new conversation. I'm gonna shut it down for now. I'll tell you why, because there's a whole lesson dedicated to this. You're talking about what we can do to battle antisemitism, going to the offense, not just the defense. Right now, I'm trying to keep the conversation on how do we stay positive, stay, that sort of thing. Okay. So we are a little behind time, so I'm going to pick up the pace a little bit. So the third prong, which we spoke about in terms of dealing with our emotions, was I fear not because you are with me. Anybody want to try to guess? I don't know if that's fair. What is the most often repeated two-word phrase in the entire Tanakh? It's actually, believe it or not, al tira, do not fear. This phrase appears in the Bible 44 times. If you add to that, anytime it appears in the plural, al tira'u, it appears another 26 times, or as many as 110 times if you include other slight variations of the phrase. Why is this such an important thing? Because Hashem felt the need to not only make this a consistent theme that we should know that we shouldn't be afraid, but he actually made a point of making sure that every single one of our ancestors were told the words al tira. So it appears in the Bible 44 times, including the plural 70 times, including translations 109 times. But it's also,
Whoa.
It's also, we're getting there, hold on. It's also something that Hashem wants us to take as a message that this has to be part and parcel of our Judaism. I think we're all familiar with King David's quote, and Joanne, you're unmuted, so why don't you read for us, please, text 6 from the very famous Psalm 23.
A song of David. God is my shepherd, I shall not lack. He allows me to lay down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. Even if I walk in the valley of death's shadow, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me.
King David was a shepherd. He was a very caring shepherd. The Medrash tells us about how he would shepherd sheep in his flock of different ages, and how different ones were able to reach different their digestive systems and their teeth, etc. They were able to digest different levels of grass or whatever, how soft or how tall, etc. And he would make sure to feed them in the correct order so that the older ones, for instance, were getting fed first, whereas the younger ones would be able to eat after them because the older ones wouldn't be able to process the lower grass or whatever. This is how much he cared about every single sheep in his flock. And this is the analogy that King David chooses to use about God. That God is like our shepherd. Lest you think that King David, because his name kind of is like a misnomer, we talk about him as King David, as if he was just this king who sat in his palace all day, etc. But many of us know that King David's early life was not like that. He spent a lot of time on the run from King Saul, who was looking to kill him. And even after he was king, his life was not always fine and dandy. And he had many opportunities not to call God his shepherd. It didn't seem like God was his shepherd. God has all sorts of other things in store for him. And yet to him, any negative situation that there was, God was always fully in the picture. And this introduces the last point we want to talk about with regards to emotions, which is that we have to recognize that there has to be a certain amount of trust in God. Please turn your attention to the video screens for a brief video presentation.
In January 1948, in the dark hours of the Soviet Union, a child was born in Stalino who was destined to symbolize mighty struggles. A bitter, global struggle between the bald eagle and the brown bear in the throes of their Cold War. A lopsided struggle between terrifying tyranny and human rights, between brutally enforced atheism and the free soul of a believer, between monstrous anti-Semitism and a proud Jew, and between the temptation to collapse and the superhuman will to survive. Nathan Sharansky graduated from Moscow's Physical Technical Institute before joining the underground human rights movement, reclaiming his Jewish heritage and emerging as a foremost dissident and spokesman for human rights. In 1973, Nathan took the calculated risk of applying for an exit visa to Israel. He was denied and rose to the forefront of Jewish refusnik activities.
Well, I was in the middle of the struggle when the situation looked very dangerous, when some of my friends in Helsinki group were already arrested, when new wave of repressions against Jewish activists was clearly prepared. And at this time I received a note from my wife Avital through some American Jewish tourists. And together with this note, a small psalm book. And Avital writes that this psalm book was with me in the last year when I was trying to help you in different places in the world. And I have a feeling that the time has come to send it to you. And I opened the book, and I can't read there anything because I never learned how to read these texts. And also, most of the words I don't know. Many of the words I know, about 1,000 words, mainly of our daily struggle, prison, repressions, demonstrations, but not these words. So I decided I don't have time for these small things when I'm very busy now in organizing demonstrations and press conferences, and almost forgot.
In 1977, he was arrested on false charges of spying for the United States. But prior to the announcement of his verdict, he famously declared, "To the court I have nothing to say. To my wife and the Jewish people I say, next year in Jerusalem." Sentenced to 13 years imprisonment, he spent the next 16 months some 1,600 miles away from Jerusalem, in Moscow's Lefortovo prison, often in solitary confinement and in a special torture cell, before being transferred to a Siberian labor camp.
They bring me the list of things that they confiscated, and there is mentioned this small black book, not in Russian. And I understand that they are talking about this psalm book, which was sent to by Vital. And then I remember this note which is sent. And I demand that they'll give it to me, and it was a long struggle. 3 years after I was arrested, they returned this book to me, together with the telegram from my mother that my father passed away. And it's, of course, it's difficult when, it's always difficult, but when you cannot be with your family. And I decided that the only thing which I can do, I will be reading this psalm book until I understand. And so I'm reading these hundreds of thousands of words where I cannot understand where the sentence begins and ends, and cannot understand more than half of the words. And then simply comparing between different places of these words, I try to find out the connection between them. And it so happened that the first phrase from all these hundreds of thousands of words was a short phrase of 13 very short words, which I understood fully. That is the phrase, Gam ki elech bagay salamavet lo ira ra ki ata imadi. It's from the Psalm Kav Gimel, and when you'll go through the valley of shadow of death, you'll fear no evil because you are with me. And that was very powerful. It was very important for me. And each time when they were taking it from me, I was fighting and on hunger strikes, refusing to work, sometimes refusing to eat until they'll bring it to me back.
He resisted and persisted with remarkable courage. His miracle dawned in 1986 when he was released in a prisoner exchange. Leading Israeli officials, including Prime Minister Shimon Peres, welcomed him to Jerusalem.
And even when they already took me from prison and replaced all my clothes, I was lying in the snow refusing to enter the airplane without getting this book back because I felt that all my strength is there. So that was the only piece of property which I took from prison, and all these years it's always with me, and it gives me a lot of strength.
The Hebrew phrases in Sharansky's Petit Black Book were authored 28 centuries earlier by King David, who reigned from the splendid city of which Sharansky dreamed, Jerusalem. It was he who crafted the powerful line of prophetic poetry that lent indestructible hope and undefeatable strength to endless generations of Jews in distress. Even if I must tread through a valley forged by death's own shadow, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. A fountain of eternal confidence generated on behalf of each Jew in every century in the face of the mightiest and most monstrous obstacles. You are not alone. God is with you. Walk with confidence. The Creator of the universe stands guard at your side.
Now, I don't think that this always has, the perfect solution to everything. In other words, God is there even when we struggle, right? And God is there even when we're hurting. And that doesn't mean necessarily that all that's going to go away because we're believing in God. But we would do well to take a leaf out of Sharansky's book, in that when the anxiety and the negativity becomes too much, we close our eyes and we recognize that Hashem is my shepherd. What does that mean? Back to the quote from King Solomon, Daiga b'lev ish yashichena, which in Hebrew means that if a man has worry in his heart, he should quash it. There's actually an alternate reading of the verse where instead of saying yashichena, it says yasichena, which means that he should speak about it with someone. If you have a worry on your heart, and this is common folk advice as well, right? That if you're worried about something, talk it out with a friend. We all know the value of that. We all know the value of someone being with you, right? Anytime anybody talks about a struggle they went through, it's always much more painful. It's like, and I was all alone, right? Because having someone with you brings a powerful sense of calm and of camaraderie, of I'm not alone in this. And that is the purpose of recognizing that having bitachon, or trust in God, makes us recognize that it's not like there's no one in the world that's with me. I'm all alone in this. Everyone's out to get me. But instead, Hashem is there with me. It makes us recognize that instead of taking the blessings in life as granted, for granted, we take them as granted, right? As granted by God. And the same was true, by the way, for many Jews throughout exile, which is why we have text 8. Where are we here? Ron, can you read for us, please? Text 8.
Whenever Jews are persecuted, the godly presence is, so to speak, persecuted along with them. As it is stated, in all their pain, he is pained.
Isn't that interesting? The Talmud is making a point of telling us, B'chol tzarasam lo tsar, that any tsar, any sort of pain that you might be in, God is there with you. He doesn't disappear at that moment, right? What's the famous analogy where the footsteps in the sand, and it says, that's when I was carrying you, my son? when life is full of unsettling moments, we have to recognize that God is always in control. And when we do that, we are comforted by the very fact that God's presence is there. Does that make the challenges go away? No. But the trust in Hashem does two things. Number one, it makes it easier to accept, both because we know that everything that comes from God is good. And now is not the time for that to, to have a lengthy conversation about how suffering that we go through even that can be part of God's goodness, etc. But actually, Ron, if you continue for us, please, text 9, that trust actually brings about, it makes us more worthy of blessing.
Those who trust in God will be surrounded by benevolence.
Isn't that interesting? The trust itself brings more goodness. Trusting in Hashem brings more goodness. Okay, but now let's turn from the emotional, right? So just to summarize, I think we took a 3-pronged approach. And if we want to split it even less into 2, that when the emotions that are brought on by anti-Semitism seem to become too much, we can take a 2-pronged approach. Number 1, optimism. Number 2, faith, right? Optimism in terms of the fact that we can find things to be positive about, whether it's looking at the larger picture, recognizing the miracle of our survival, etc. And then faith by recognizing that we're not alone. And recognize that Hashem is here. Recognize that therefore what we're going through, actually, there's a plan. It's not just, floating around there. And Hashem has our best interests at heart. Okay, so that's on the emotional side of things. What about on the action side of things, right? So if we revisit our conversation that we had at the beginning, where we asked the question, right? Here it is. Hold on. What were some of the actions that you or others around you took as a result of the incident? It turns out that it's direct result of our emotions. When we're feeling anxious, when we're feeling angry, when we're feeling outraged, then it leads to certain actions, whatever it is, maybe inactions, right? It leads to saying, I'm fearful, so therefore I'm not going to call the police. I don't want to make a big tzimis out of it, right? I am angry, so therefore I'm going to go and do something rash, where I'll say something that now I'm wrong too. Not just are they wrong, but I'm wrong too. But with renewed optimism and faith, we can now turn to what is the proper way to go about action. Okay, so based on optimism and faith, how do we now approach action? Now, so I want to start off with a question that I actually think is not bothering any of you, which is as follows. I mean, I would love if you would share in the chat if this is something that has actually occurred to you. We all know that trusting in God, believing in God, means that we know that God is going to take care of us. And yet something gives me the impression that all of you still have jobs and that you're working for your living, even though God provides, right? And even though we know God gives us health, something makes me think all of you still visit doctors. So, I mean, the world has a way of saying God helps those who help themselves, right? But I guess the question that I'm asking is, what is the Jewish approach to what is the human godly balance, right? Or to put it this way, what role does human effort play? And we'll get to question 2 in just a moment, because that we're going to turn to the Purim story in just a moment. Or another way of asking the question is in exercise 1.2. Let's see, we can go on here. Heidi, maybe you want to share with us. Using the words God and human action, craft a sentence that best expresses your impression of Judaism's vision for the divine mortal interplay on matters like security. So let's say you're talking about keeping your house secure, right? You obviously don't believe you're just supposed to trust in God and then take the doors off the hinges, right? That's a little silly. You also don't believe that if God wanted a burglar to break into your house, any lock is going to keep him out, right? So we trust and believe in God, and yet at the same time, we're doing actions in order to protect ourselves. Can you craft a sentence for me that dictates how you view, in your perspective, the God-human balance here?
Well, there's 2 things I would say. One is faith without works is dead. And something I picked up years ago was actions first, feelings follow. So what that means to me is you have to be proactive, like, God, like I believe God is available all the time. But unless you actually participate as a partner, then you can't have any impact on the outcome. But it's your responsibility to take the principles of your faith in God and act on them and carry them into the world.
So God gives us
The
principles,
tools, but we have to use them.
tools, and we have to use them. Okay, there you go.
Exactly.
That's a good sentence right there. God gives us the tools, but we have to use them. We're going to examine this topic through the story of Purim. When it comes time, when the whole Purim decree comes out, the evil decree from Haman comes out, and in the 4th chapter of the book of Esther, we read how Mordecai, the leader of the Jewish people, learns about the decree, and he knows that his niece or daughter or whatever, I think niece is the most common explanation, is in the palace, and she's the queen, and that she's their best chance at diplomacy. He says to her, it's time to act. It's time for you to do something. And Esther's response is fascinating. Heidi, once you're unmuted, can you read for us, please? Text 10.
Yep. Okay. Esther dictated a message to be sent back to Mordecai. Go and assemble all the Jews who live in Shushan. Let them fast on my behalf. Let them neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night and day. I and my maidens will fast likewise. And then I shall go to the king, although it is contrary to the law. If I am to perish, I shall perish.
So Esther,
Mordecai went. You want me to read the rest?
Where are you? Sorry. Oh yeah, go ahead. Go ahead. Sorry.
Mordecai went ahead and implemented all that Esther had commanded him. On the 3rd day, Esther donned her royal apparel and stood in the inner court of the king's palace.
Thank you. So Esther's going to try by means of diplomacy to save the Jewish people. Right now, for some context, for those that haven't read the Megillah in long enough, I want to remind you that Esther had not been to the king's chamber, and she wasn't allowed to go into the king's chamber in X amount of days. I think it was more than 30 days. So she's going to enter the king's chamber, and she's going to try to curry favor, right? Now, I don't know about you, but I have to give a class to 8 people on Zoom. I dress my best. I try to make sure I had a coffee. I try to make sure that I'm ready to present, right? Esther says to herself, I'm about to go into the king. He hasn't seen me in 30 days, right? And she decides, you know what, I'm going to go in right after a 3-day fast. I want you to picture what it is that you feel like and what it is that you look like after Yom Kippur, after not fasting for 1 day, okay? Women particularly, you can think about this. Now, triple that. And Esther decides this is the best way for me to enter this madman's palace, who I happen to be married to curry favor with him. And I'm going to come in and try to turn on my charm and see what I can do. Something's off here. Like what's going on, right? Or as they ask it on the screen here, there we go. Why does Esther seem to undermine her diplomatic effort? In other words, she's clearly doing an act of diplomacy. We know she believes in God, but she also believes that God helps those who help themselves, right? So she's doing something. Or as Heidi would put it, God gives you the tools. He put her in the position. Now you got to go use them. So why is she undermining her efforts? So this is where I want to make a little tweak to what we're talking about here. It turns out that Chassidus has a very powerful insight when it comes to the divine human balance. When the Jewish people were in the desert, as we know, for 40 years, they were completely provided for by God. God gave them manna from heaven to eat, water from a magical spring from Miriam's stone to drink. They were protected by the clouds of glory. Everything was taken care of. And yet we find that when Chassidus contrasts that state of existence to our state of existence, it doesn't say, oh, in the desert, God provided. But currently, we create, we make things happen. No. Chassidus explains that actually, they're completely identical. Both of them come directly from God. Hold on just one second. Both of them come directly from God. Even in today's day and age, when we work and make a living, it's that everything is coming directly from God, exactly the same way the manna was coming. So what's the difference? The difference is actually that in the way that God created the world today, and I'll elaborate on this in just a moment, is that God wanted the world to be a world of concealment. So he's still the one who provides for us, but he wants to pretend like it's not him. Now, the reasons for this are very philosophical, and it ties into freedom of choice. He doesn't want to force anyone's hand to believe in God. If manna is falling from the heaven, that's the only way you eat. It's a little hard not to believe in God, right? And if water is coming out of a stone, it's very hard for you not to believe in God, because anytime God wants it, you don't have what you need. And anytime God wants it, you do have what you need, right? So what God does is God says, listen, I still want to have a partnership with you, but I don't want you to recognize my input. So even currently, our earnings are gifted from God, but we have to give God the space to act. That's the partnership that we have. So if we had to tweak that folk saying, God helps those who help themselves, I would say God helps those who make it appear as if they are helping themselves. So in other words, in this world, everything comes from God, right? And yet there's a world of concealment. How do we solve that paradox? How do we recognize what's going on here? We are the ones who are creating the concealment. Hashem is giving everything, but we have to do something in order to create a concealment through our work in order to allow for God's blessing to come into it. So we plant the seed in the ground. Does that do anything? That doesn't bring a tree. Godly energy brings the tree. But when we plant the seed in the ground, we kind of create this illusion of us working and us bringing something about. And then God says, okay, no problem. That's the space for me to act. And then he makes something grow. And what this does to us as human beings is it allows us to actually work hard at trusting him, because it's difficult. Everybody wants to say, as we'll read shortly, that I'm beat their chest. I'm the one who made it happen. Right? But Hashem says, no. I'm going to make it look as if you did it, but you make sure you keep that trust in me. Ron, can you read for us text 11, please?
All righty.
Page 28, text 11.
I got it. Everything that comes into being in this material world must materialize through natural means. Nature, however, is simply a garment, meaning God's energy bringing things into existence must be dressed, concealed, and obscured to the point that an observer sees only a world that appears to run naturally. In truth, however, everything emerges directly from God himself. He obscures the divine bestowals until the miraculous and supernatural reality of material existence is not observable, and material developments seem perfectly natural. When, for example, God provides an individual with an ample livelihood, it is not done through a miracle as it was in the Sinai desert, when God rained manna and meat from the skies. Rather, God sends the blessing through the individual's business affairs. The gains reaped through commerce appear so natural that the individual can be fooled into thinking along the lines of, it is my strength that generated this wealth. In Deuteronomy 8:17, it is my wisdom that led to my success. Ecclesiastes 2:9, for I am well versed in commerce. I know what to buy and the most prudent times to sell. This arrangement works as long as we prepare a valid garment through which the divine flow of sustenance can descend into a material reality. Our occupation must be proportionate so that according to the rules of nature, the sum required for our livelihood could theoretically be gained by such an occupation. If this requirement is met, our occupation serves as a perfect garment in which God can disguise his blessing. For we could easily claim, I acquired this wealth through my own skills. because it is indeed considered natural for such an occupation to yield that range of profit. Since such an assertion is logically sound, our occupation is an appropriate conduit for God's kindness. Accordingly, we will work. We should be mindful. While we work, we should be mindful of our belief that our earnings are God's blessing. They are like any other open miracle, like the miracle of the manna. Our actions merely weave a garment behind which God can disguise his blessing. One should apply the same concept to all other areas of life. Pursue your needs in accordance with your understanding, with the intention of forging an appropriate garment through which God will send his blessing. God will then act as he sees fit, providing the truest form of good that is appropriate for you.
Thank you, Ron. So to amend Heidi's statement from beforehand, it's not just that God gives us tools and we create, it's actually much deeper than that. God gives us tools so that we can pretend to create, and then God creates. Because he's just giving us an opportunity to allow his blessing to come in. He's allowing us to make a vessel through which his blessing will come in. Now, applying this to security, it would seem that it doesn't really change much of our actions. We still go about our own reasonable, rational ways. A shul gets shot up. All the shuls around the country beef up their security. They hire security guards. They get they raise their walls. They change where their entrance is from. Maybe someone carries in the shul now, etc., right? Hiring security guards to stand outside. All this is fine and normal and regular standard way of doing things. And it would seem that the only thing that really changed was our mindset. How do we look at our actions? Are our actions what's actually causing the result, or are our actions just creating a space where God can create the result, or the security in this instance? But as it turns out, that there is a difference in our actions. And that's where we want to go one step further. And this brings us back to the story of Esther. Esther recognized that it wasn't her actions at all. All she had to do was create a vessel, an appearance, a concealment where God can then say, all right, no problem, I'll act now. All she had to do was plant the seed in the ground. What did she change in her actions? She recognized the most important thing she was able to do was beef up the spiritual side of things. Let's see text 12. Joanne, please. Sorry, Joanne, you're muted.
Okay.
Text 12.
Esther's conduct demonstrated that she considered her act of approaching Ahasuerus as a mere garment for God's salvation, knowing that it would in fact be an entirely supernatural miracle. It was therefore necessary that the Jews first pray and fast to become worthy of such a miracle. Nevertheless, because God desired that the supernatural salvation should appear to be within the natural order, Mordecai instructed Esther to make an appeal to Ahasuerus, despite the grave risk. Consequently, it was not of great significance for the features of the garment to meet all the demands of the natural order. For the primary concern was not the medium through which God's salvation would arrive, but rather the need to ensure that the cause for salvation had been secured.
So Esther had her head screwed on super strict. She knew exactly what she was doing. Of course, she has to go into the king. Of course, she has to turn her charm on and she has to do her best. But she also needs to make most of that vessel was done. But she needs to make very, very sure that the actual cause of their salvation, whether it's davening, in this case, fasting, giving tzedakah, learning Torah, whatever, all the different things that we know that we can do to beef up the spiritual side of our worthiness, she knew that was the primary thing. So what is primary and what's secondary? So if the primary thing takes a little bit away from the secondary, right? She was like, all right, no problem. So my vessel is not a perfect vessel. My garment, my concealment that I'm making is not a perfect concealment because I might not look 100% charmed or beautiful, whatever, when as I go into the king, because it'll be after 3 days of fasting. I'm doing sufficient there. And the only reason why that's not more is because I'm focusing on what's most important, on the primary thing. So it doesn't just affect our mindset, it also affects what's primary and what's secondary. This can be applied, of course, as well to security. Now, this can be applied in a very personal sense. Here they have a great analogy, putting locks on your doors in a mezuzah. Of course, you need to put up a lock on your door, right? You need to create a space for God's protection. But if you're putting locks on your doors and there isn't a mezuzah on your door, right? Or if even worse, if putting up the lock somehow, I don't know in what scenario this would be true, but if putting up the lock somehow takes down the mezuzah, or I guess here's a good example of it. When Jews think, I'll take my mezuzah off the door, this will make me more secure because they won't know that I'm Jewish, whatever it is. Now you're defeating the whole purpose. You are making a vessel, but you're getting too carried away with the secondary point, which is creating a space for God to act. You're not actually doing your primary part of the effort, which is actually securing God's protection with a mezuzah. So that's the question. Where is the primary focus? And this, by the way, stood in direct contrast to the Jews who attended the feast of Achashverosh and ate non-kosher food. We're told there were Jews who ate non-kosher food at the times of Achashverosh. These weren't Jews who didn't keep kosher, maybe because they didn't grow up with it, because they didn't know about it. Excuse me. These were Jews who actually chose to transgress one time eating non-kosher in order to curry favor with the king. Esther said, this is not going to work. You're mixing up your primary and your secondary. And that's what she said. I'm willing to forego a little bit of the secondary nature of things, which is the vessel that I'm making for God's action, and leave the primary intact and as full and robust as it ever can be. Now, there is an amazing story that I want to share with you. There's a video of it, so hold on just a moment with me. In April of 1990, Mr. Eliakim Rubinstein, who was an aide to Prime Minister Yitzchak Shamir in Eretz Israel, in the land of Israel, sent a message to the Rebbe that the PLO, Palestinian Liberation Authority, was planning terror attacks at specific Jewish targets around the world. So the Rebbe now has to act, right? That's what happens. You get information, now you have to react. And let's watch what happens. And then afterwards, I'd like to summarize and go through with you how the Rebbe literally summarizes this lesson in his reaction to this information. Let me just make sure it's shared with the sound and the video. Hold on.
An excerpt from the Jewish educational media film Faithful and Fortified, Volume 3, Israel's Government Leaders. Rabbi Benjamin Klein is a member of the Rebbe's Secretariat.
Ich bin vor mir zwei kalt das Telefon, ich gebe ihm ein Telefon, kalt das, Shami will reden mit mir. Hat die kalt herumstehen. Also der Rabbi, als wir sagen kommen eine Idee, als der Aschaf geht bombardieren an einer Sachplatz, nicht in einem Platz. Aber man weiß den Platz, kennen Sie aber in der Welt, in der Sachheit in der Welt. Better Woche. Ich gehe gewoon klappt naar Rebbe Stier, der Rebbe mir geöffnet, und dann sagen die Menschen, Rebbe doch nicht mehr, du wissen die gar nicht. Ich habe gesagt, Menschen, ja, ne Welt nicht. Sie kommen bei mir her, kann ich nicht wissen, weil kann ich, wenn ein Office in die Zeit, zwei Säger nicht da kein Office. Und ich rein, kommt zu mir her, der Rebbe, es wird am Tag, und der Rebbe hat sich heute gedreht nach mir her, und dann gehen wir reden wegen der Mien.
Es ist gekommen eine Idee, schon von Mincha, als Oshof hat auch gegeben bei Juro zu der Machloki sein, der Bechol Mokim Shuhu, als Hoyu Lissi, soll sich schäppen mit Zähne Israel und schäppen sich, wie bei sie kommt, der schäppen sich, hat das Ayini verbunden mit dem Guf, Bechule, wilde Haarig, Bedover haben Pulsam, und beflattlich auf Tief Tachpeh, Bemeli doch verstandig, aber es darf mäßig sein. Ich soll ein Kirchenmelde mit P, wenn er geht zu Kolonionen verbunden mit P, unheimlich. Von dem da gesoffen, dem da Teil, was man durchschiedet. Es doch verstandig, dass er Ekel mit Kore, Kolonionen Bildere zu ihm, ואדרבה מזה מהפך הדור רוזל צוקום כיסן אוהל מן החשך וכיסן החוכמה מן השכלוס.
Ja, dann ich hab dann zu gucken, einer guckt auf ihn. Das ist eine Sache, private Sache, ne? Darauf wollte ich mal sagen, die 2 Schätze gekommen, ja, aber sie das gewinnen. Da habe ich gehört, und da ging es. Ein New York Times nicht wenn von dem haben. New York Times haben sich gewinnen in News, weil in der Zeit nicht wussten, die News, das soll gewinnen in News. Also sie gewinnen als das Sache. Also in New York Times ist gestanden am Morgen, als mit gewollt bombardieren, weißt du, dass es gewonnen ist. Aber nicht weil der Rebbe, nicht der gestern.
Und der Pfarrer sagt, Massim, hat gebaut der Chabad, sich nicht mehr in Unionen von Tinies. A viele, wenn das verbunden ist mit der Loch, mit der Minig Bechulu, verbalten das mit bis Doko Präg und viele das echt kommen, trachten gut, wird sein gut. Aber du soll nicht nigerer werden, als wir sollen. In Kamus als Docker, ich nicht in Neches als Docker. Und nicht mäßig sein, in dem Juche, bei Kescher Lose, am Methodologien, der Schovi, der Wert von Gimel Sudeis, und ich bei der Geitz, Kolpon, sagen Gimel, mis mehr Teilen von ihm, Miras Israel. Und Martevin drauf Kehl sein oder mäßig sein, die müssen wir hacheln bei Asium, was verändert sich, und das ist der Chesem, wenn Kehl schon mit Halle Jütke, Halle Luke, weil der sehr, Kol Chad wird sich Mischai sein, was nachher kommt Tonnenduf in der Richtung und in dem Ruach, und Malachas kam, dass er sich Kehlen in sich hat mehr sein, anders im Noschen Vita, was gefunden sich bis wie Wosse. Da hab ich nicht Mapchi sein sehen, aber bejachert im See, sehen, als soll Messi sein, mit Telo, mit Svese, mit Techal Chor und mit ihr Bitochen Amiti.
Order the film today at gemstore.com.
So let's analyze here for a moment what exactly it is that the Rebbe did. The Rebbe receives a threat, worldwide threat. By the way, one of those things that's not in the Rebbe's control to actually do anything about, right? The Rebbe can't protect every single Jewish target that may or may not be in the world. Yet the Rebbe has a very clear and focused approach. From the get-go, the Rebbe does not breed in negativity. Doesn't even let it affect him. I understand that takes a tremendous amount of self-discipline, right? But the closer we can get to that, the better we'll be. Number 2, immediately reduce the panic. Whatever tips you can use, a lot of tips were shared today, but immediately reduce the panic. The Rebbe was introducing people to the fact that there was a terrorist threat. And yet the Rebbe makes sure to speak in a calm, cool, and collected voice, and there's nothing to worry about, and nobody should spread panic, etc. Number 3, the Rebbe underscores the importance of building our trust in the shepherd. The Rebbe even suggests that we say some Tehillim, we say some Psalms, right? That we trust in Hashem. And then finally, what can we do? What sort of action can we do? Now, if this was a situation, by the way, where there was something specific that the Rebbe should have been doing to protect himself, of course, that should have been done as well, right? Or to protect the community, then of course that should have been done as well. But in this instance, the Rebbe is making sure to focus on the primary, which is more Torah, more mitzvahs, etc., and then the threat didn't materialize. And I would say it was directly related to these actions. And so to conclude today's lesson, how can we be a little bit more Esther-like in our lives? The next time that there's an anti-Semitic attack, the next time that there's an anti-Semitic anything, what can we do to recognize that there's a primary obligation that we have here to add in Torah and mitzvahs, etc. And there's a secondary obligation that we have here, which is to make a vessel for the security that we need in our lives. How can we reduce the panic? How can we have less anxiety, less fear, less anger, right? And hopefully over the course of the past 90 minutes, you've received some tips in this regard. How can we be a little bit more like Esther is in the story of Purim? Please turn your attention to the video screen for a summary of today's lesson.
Lesson 1. The Eternal People. 1. Worrying creates dejection and ineptitude. To address an issue effectively, we need to reduce the anxiety associated with it. 2. The Jewish people are an eternal people. History has shown that despite the pain and suffering that we have endured, the Jews and Judaism always survive and thrive. Recognizing this is an important step toward feeling optimistic about our people and about our future. 3. To be realistic means to not lose sight of the fact that we are living in one of the best eras for Jews, and that we should be thankful for that. For the first time in millennia, the vast majority of Jews do not live under regimes that persecute Jews. And in some countries, while individual acts of anti-Semitism have risen, the data also show that fewer people overall harbor anti-Semitic sentiments than previously. 4. The ultimate Jewish answer to anxiety is bitachon. We are empowered to ingrain in our minds a trusting attitude, feeling that God is going to take care of us and that He will be with us even when we pass through dark times. In fact, placing our trust in God triggers the opening of channels for additional revealed goodness. 5. The Torah teaches us that the success of any of our endeavors is God's providence and blessing. Nothing in our lives is a mere product of nature. God instructs us, however, to create a garment through which His blessings can operate in disguise. Hence, we must take all the natural steps, whether to earn a livelihood or to protect ourselves from anti-Semites. But the blessing is entirely God's doing. 6. Accordingly, our efforts to engage in the logical methods of protecting ourselves are inseparable from our efforts to secure God's protection. In the Purim story, Queen Esther recognized this, and she therefore prioritized being worthy of God's protection over being attractive to Achashverosh.
Thank you all for joining us for lesson 1 of Outsmarting Antisemitism. We look forward to greeting you all next week at exactly the same time, 1:00 p.m. on Zoom, or at 7:30 p.m. in person. You are welcome to fluctuate between the two. Lesson 2, no apologies.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you, Sushi.
Okay.